In this video, we're going to look at JavaScript. So this is going to be an introduction to JavaScript. So we looked at a number of different steps involved in page design and production, right? Doing the user analysis and task analysis, and based on that, designing the structure of the website. We looked at page design and content creation. For example, designing the content for scannability. And in this video, we're going to look at programming, right? So especially using JavaScript, adding code to your web pages. And by adding code to your web pages, it allows dynamic behaviors to be created on the web pages. So that's the role of JavaScript. It must be noted that JavaScript is a full-blown programming language, but for historical reasons and the roots of it is the web. Right? It's a particular language that has been designed to create dynamic behaviors that go on web pages. In other words, it has been specially designed as a scripting language to add code to web pages, and it has become an international standard based on the ECMA script standard. Of course, you might think, instead of JavaScript, why not use some other language? It's certainly possible, but JavaScript was there for historical reasons first, and it has been the main language for embedding dynamic behaviors on the web pages today. Who knows? In the years to come, some other language might be used, but for now, JavaScript is the main language for embedding and programming dynamic behaviors on web pages. Since JavaScript is a full-blown programming language, you can use it to do many things. You can even implement a web server using JavaScript. Right? But for this subject, we're going to look at the use of JavaScript for two main purposes: for validating data that the user enters through the web forms, displaying error messages, as well as for session tracking, cookies. But we also look at other JavaScript libraries that are available, for instance, to get location information and so on. Right? So there's much to explore in JavaScript, but we're going to first focus on the use of JavaScript for these two aspects. So when a user fills in a form, instead of submitting what the user fills in immediately to the web server, right? So when a user fills in a form and clicks submit, instead of sending all that information to the web server and then on a web server checking that, some fields have been filled in wrongly. For example, if it's credit card, but the user, instead of typing in a credit card, the user types in the name there, or in the field for the name, the user types in the credit card, let's say by mistake. So instead of submitting all that information to the server and checking and validating that data on the server side, in other words, rubbish has been sent from the client to the server. Right? If the validation is done on the server side, the errors that the user entered on the form are transmitted over the internet to the server side. So in other words, there's a waste of bandwidth. Right? So for instance, the wrong data that I entered in the credit card field, let's say I entered my name in the credit card field for by mistake, right? That wrong information is sent over the internet to the server, and the error is only discovered on the server side. Right? So I've wasted the transfer of data. So the idea of client-side validation, client-side data validation using JavaScript is that even before any information is sent to the server side, check it on the browser first. Right? So for instance, if I type the wrong thing in the credit card field, I instead of typing a number, I type a name in the credit card field. Before anything is sent to the server in the browser using JavaScript code, I can already validate. It can tell me, credit card field, you're supposed to enter numbers, not a name, right? And then I can change it on the browser side before anything is sent to the server side. So, and here's a list of things that you can do validation. You can, for example, if you have to enter the password twice, you can make sure that on the password field and the re-enter password field, these two strings should be the same, right? And you can check the existence of certain characters. If it's supposed to be an email, you can check the existence of certain characters, which will not necessarily ensure that the email is an email, but at least it will pick out some common errors. You can check, for instance, that the credit card expiry date is entered is whether the credit card has expired, right? Just by comparing it with today's date, right? If the field is expecting a number, that it is indeed a number, and so on, right? And you can also check that certain fields are non-null, right? So the idea of validation on the client side using JavaScript is that all these simple checks, a layer, if you like, of simple checks can be done before any information is sent to the server. And then, of course, on the server, there might be additional checks to verify the credit card number further and so on, right? But by doing some preliminary checks on the browser using JavaScript, you can prevent rubbish from being sent from the browser to the server, right? And once it passes all the checks here on the browser, information is sent to the server, and at the server side, you can still do further checks, further processing of the data and so on. Right. So that's the idea of data validation on the client side using JavaScript. So you can write code. So I'm going to just show here the code that is used to trim the text input. So the user might have some blank spaces or white spaces before the actual string that is entered, and some white spaces after. And you can write JavaScript code here, which basically scans through the string, right? So this is just basic JavaScript code that scans through the string from the first character, and while it is a white space, so while the character at the start position, start POSN, is equals to the white space, it will just keep on incrementing until it gets a non-white space character, and then after that, N POSN will scan the string to look for from the other end of the string to look for all the white characters. So you can see that at the end of these two while loops, start POSN will point to the first non-white space character, and end POSN will point to the last non-white space character. Right? So and the white spaces before that and after that are trimmed. So you can spend a bit of time looking into tracing this code using an example to figure out what this code does, but that's essentially it. So when you type in an email definitely has an @ sign. So you might do some preliminary checks. Index of will look for the @ character in the email, and if it doesn't have it, that means it cannot be a valid email. So notice that this check is a very weak check. If it's an email, it definitely has an @ sign. But if the string has an @ sign, does not mean that it is an email. Later on, we will look at other more stringent tests that you can do on strings to ensure that it's indeed an email. You can check the expiry date of the credit card, right? For instance, whether it is after the current date or not. If it is not, that means it is expired, right? So you can check, firstly, whether it's a number or not. Is NaN will return true if it's not a number. And then you can also check today's date, right? So just in the JavaScript library, there's a capital D date object that you can create, which will return you the current year, month, and day, the current date, which you can then compare with the date that the user entered as the expiry date of the credit card. And you can also use it to validate characters, right? So for instance, what the user typed in are just numbers, or what the user typed in are just alphanumeric characters and so on. Right? And here's a bit of code. I won't talk about it in too much detail, but you can certainly trace through what this code does. And the idea of this code is to take the value, which is, for instance, what the user has typed in, and compare each character that the user has typed in with the characters in valid chars in this argument called valid chars. And if it is valid, then each of the character would be one of the characters in valid chars. Right? So here's an example of using that function that we defined previously, is integer x. So it's checking if every character that is in x, so x is a string, if every character in x is one of the characters in the second argument of valid value, which is it, in other words, is it a digit? Is it true that every character in x is a digit? Right? That's what it does. And 0 controls whether it's a lower uppercase, whether it's case sensitive or not. Okay, so password field, again, when the user is asked to re-enter the password, it should be the same, right? So if it's different, then it returns false, right? This function. And then if you want to make sure that the field is non-null, that means the user did enter something for that field in that form, then you can use this you can call this function. So if the user didn't enter anything, is now will be equivalent to the empty string, and it will return true. Right? Later on, we will find that in HTML5 there are certain attributes that we can use that can tell the browser to do some of these checks automatically, but we'll come back to that later. So you can use all these validation functions together. So if the user types in values for these different fields, and then according to what you want to check for each of these fields, you can use some of the functions that we saw earlier. Right, so you can include JavaScript code into HTML, right? So you have the form that you saw in the previous slide, and notice that there are some attributes like name, method, action, right? So the idea is that when the user types in stuff into the form and clicks on the submit button, on submit, you can see that the attribute on submit equals the return check. When the user clicks on the submit button, what will happen is that the browser will then call the function check that is specified in the on submit attribute. And when it calls the function check, that function check will then call some of the other functions to check the password, to check this, check that we saw in the previous slides. And if check returns true, information will then be posted to the server. If check returns false, then information will not be posted to the server, and you can also write some JavaScript code to display an error message, for instance, to the user. So nothing is posted to the server if that function check returns false. It won't advance, in other words, the page won't advance to the next page. But if check returns true, all the information that is entered by the user will be posted to the server using the get method. Right? That's why the get method is specified there in the attribute method, and it will be posted to a program that's going to receive all these form details, and that program is in a directory called PHP in this example, and that program is called new account.php. So it's a PHP program. We'll look at PHP later on in the subject, but the idea is whatever that is entered by the user, when the user clicks submit and calls the function check, which then calls all the other JavaScript validation functions we saw in the previous slides, and if all that returns true, then check will return true, and the information entered by the user will be posted to the server, and on the server side, it will be all that information will be received by this program called new account.php. And new account.php, when it receives the form details on the server side, it will then do whatever processing that's required. You also notice that to access information that is in the forms, there is a kind of if you like, a document object model that is used, right? So if I wanted to look for a particular value that is entered by the user in a form, and suppose in this example here, the name of the form is called register, right? So forms can have names. In this case, the name of the form is called register. And if I want to access the information in that form, I can refer to the information using document, right, which is this document dot register. So that takes us to the form, and dot whatever the name, right? So for example, yeah, you can see here input type equals text, name equals to login, right? So there's a field called login, and if I wanted to get the value of login in JavaScript code, I can use document.register.login, for instance, right? So it's kind of an object-oriented sort of flavor here. Okay, so that function check will call all those other functions that we saw earlier and pass in information that is entered by the user. Right? So if you have an input field called pwd1 and pwd2, for instance, which is the password fields, you can refer to what the user entered into those fields using this variable. You can refer to these fields using the variable document.register.pwd1. So document.register.pwd1 is looking for the field in the form register, in the form called named register, and the name of the field is pwd1. Right? So it's comparing the values in pwd1 in the pwd1 field and in another field called pwd2, and then checking whether they are null or not, and so on. Right? You have a field called first name and a field named last name, and so on. And you, to get the actual value, you have to put dot value, right? So it is how you refer to information, the values that are entered by the user on a form. Okay. So check email. So all these functions that we saw earlier are called invoked, right? Series of functions invoked to check whatever the user has typed in, the credit card numbers, for instance, checking whether any of them is not an integer, and so on. All those code that you saw in the previous pages can be embedded and enclosed within this script tag. And this is a script element, right? So when you say script language equals to JavaScript, that's called a script element. And a script element has, in fact, all these are elements. Like title, for instance, is an element. Each element has a start and end tag. Okay, and then the form itself, we just have what we had before, right? So this we have seen this in a previous slide, the same thing, right? So it's referring to the check function that is defined within the script element within that same page. There's also other ways to refer to JavaScript code. You can all the JavaScript code can be in a separate file, and you can link to it, as we will see later. So I mentioned the use of the check email function just now, which does a very basic check about emails. Just looks for an @ sign in the email, right? So an email must have an @ sign, but if an @ sign doesn't mean that it's an email, right? The check, which is just to look for the @ sign, is a pretty weak check. Right? You can strengthen that email verification check by using what has been called regular expressions, right? So, and if you look at this this bit of code here, right, it's not just looking for the @ sign, but it's also looking for a certain structure in the string. So, and the key idea here is something called the test built-in function. So you notice that you can define what is called an email filter, and email filter here has a value, and you can see this strange looking string there, and that's what is called a regular expression, and we'll look at what that string actually means in a moment. And we can, once we define email filter, once we define that regular expression, we can call the function test, email filter.test on the given string, and that will check if the string is of a format that satisfies the regular expression as defined in email filter. So what does that regular expression actually mean? Well, it's actually checking for strings of this structure, right? So strings that start with a string of one or more characters, right? So a character is denoted by dot, one or more is denoted by plus. So dot plus means a string of one or more characters, right? So, and the head sign is start, right? So an email should start with one or more characters and then is followed by an @ sign. In other words, it must start with at least one or more character before the @ sign, right? So in other words, the email cannot start with an @ sign. And then after that is followed by another one or more characters before a dot. So you can't have an email which starts with an @ sign. You can't have an email where after the @ sign you just have a dot. So before the actual literal dot, you have to have one or more characters before that. And then after that, and then there will be some other characters after that, right? Which however many, but the email has to end, and what does it have to end with? Well, a string of 2 or 3 characters, which is denoted here, and dot with the curly brackets containing 2, 3 means 2 or 3 characters. Remember that white dot there refers to a character, and should end with that. And in other words, it's written next to the $sign, which means that it should end with 2 to 3 characters. So again, if you think about it, any email should satisfy this regular expression. But if a string satisfies this regular expression, doesn't mean that is a valid email. It looks like a valid email, but it may still not be a valid email. So you can think about examples of strings that satisfy this regular expression, but yet it is not a valid email, or it may not be a valid email. But still, this test is stronger than the previous test, which just looks for the @ sign. Right? And there are some websites out there which explains regular expressions in more detail, but for our purposes here, this is enough. Radio buttons and checkboxes, these are very common elements that we find on forms, and we can check whether any of the selections have been made on a radio button, or if any of the selections have been made on a checkbox, right, using code like this. So what happens is, because radio buttons and checkboxes have multiple choices, in other words, the choices can be represented by means of an array. So you can see here that this function get checked value, and what is passed in is, say, the name of the radio button element, and in this, on the other example, the name of the checkbox called M choice, the name of radio button is called S choice, and you notice that document.test form, test underscore form is the name of the form containing the radio button or containing the checkbox, and document.test form.sChoice is actually an array. Right? So when it's passed into get check value, you can see that the object, whether it's a radio button or checkbox, is an array, and it goes through every element of the object and checks whether it has been checked or not. So if none of them has been checked, it will return 0 or return false. If at least one of them has been checked, it will return true. And that goes for both the radio button and checkboxes. Right? And there are other examples which we will see in the labs and up on LMS itself.